Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to New America. It's always good to see people turn up for a 9 o'clock start, so we appreciate that. First of all, I want to welcome our panel. As many of you know, an important part of our cybersecurity initiative here at New America is our Fellows program. We have 30 fellows representing sort of different areas of expertise within the cybersecurity community and geographically dispersed around the United States. We also have a very clear policy here at New America as a nonpartisan think tank of being open to all different points of view. And so it's particularly nice when we spot that two of our fellows are expressing contrary viewpoints to be able to bring them together and bring that debate into the public domain for the benefit of others, and to have a fellow moderating and to be able to bring in colleagues from other think tanks to contribute to the discussion. So thank you to all of the panel. While I'm here, it would be remiss of me not to plug our annual conference, which will be happening on March 20th. See our website. If you can't register, let us know and we'll send you details of how to register. Penultimate point, please note that we'll be tweeting about this event using the hashtag Intel Overshare. And finally, let me introduce our moderator, Terry Roberts, who is going to be leading the discussion today, and will introduce the other panelists. Terry is the founder and president of Whitehawk, and is building a community for the e-commerce world, particularly focused on medium and small enterprises, having had a previous private sector career with Task and working at Carnegie Mellon. But particular relevance today, up until 2009, she had spent many years, am I allowed to say that, in the intelligence community, completing her career as the Deputy Director for Naval Intelligence. And off the back of that experience, she continues to be the co-chair of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance Cyber Council. But as I say, perhaps most important of all, she is a New America Cybersecurity Fellow. So Terry, Absolutely. Over to you.
I'm very proud of that. And I must say, good morning, everybody. New America has done an amazing job for the panel. As I was reading their backgrounds, I'm going, I'm really glad I'm moderating, because then they can do all the heavy lifting. But first, I want to start with Dave Weinstein, who is the Chief Technology Officer of New Jersey. And then previous to that, he was the Chief Information Security Officer for the Cybersecurity Advisor at the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security. He was also a senior civilian at the United States Cyber Command in Fort Meade, as well as a cyber risk consultant to Deloitte & Touche. Next, I have Robert Lee. Robert is, and actually Rob, sorry. Rob is the CEO and founder of Dragos. Previously, he actually started his cybersecurity career as an Air Force cyber warfare operations officer in the intelligence community, and also during that stint performed defense, intelligence, and attack missions across various government organizations. And last but not least is Susan Hennessey. So Susan is going to bring our national security, international law perspective to the discussions. She is the managing editor of Lawfare and a fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute. Previously, she was in the Office of the Attorney General of the National Security Agency, so also has that background to bring in. I thought what we would do is just to frame our discussions this morning. We're really focused on the recent events surrounding the DNC hack and Grizzly Step, but as that has given us an amazing idea about what is the right level, the effective level of information sharing from the US government across industry, academia, and the rest of the world. What is that balance that we need to be striving for? But just to frame up the discussions, I thought we'd start with Dave with some opening remarks and then go down the line, and then we'll do some of my Q&A because I get to go first. And then we're going to open it up for questions the last 15 minutes. So think of your questions, please, as we're having this discussion. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks to New America for convening the panel. Always good to be back in DC. So a month or so ago, since policy debates seem to be playing out on Twitter these days in less than 140 characters, Rob and I decided to have an exchange on Twitter in response to the Grizzly Step report from DHS and FBI. This is the joint analysis report in response to the Russian malicious cyber activity that has been widely reported on. And the basis for our disagreement, I think, is over a couple things. Not so much necessarily the quality of the intelligence, although I think there's some there, but the value of the government, in this case DHS and FBI, coming out with such a report, providing these, quote, indicators of compromise in order to enable, in their words, collective defense. So I found myself in the rare position, actually, of vociferously defending the Department of Homeland Security and their report, while flawed, mainly from a public policy perspective, which is one in which I favor more sharing, not less, from the federal government. And this recognition, and this is really kind of how I frame my argument, this recognition that from a public policy standpoint, the federal government, particularly the intelligence community and DHS, need to start thinking about a broader customer base, right? Traditionally, they inform policymakers, they inform military officers, but given the threat environment we're in cyberspace, more and more the intelligence community needs to position itself to inform the private sector, to inform citizens, right? It's a pivot change, or a pivot from their traditional customer base. And I think it's one that's a little uncomfortable for the intelligence community, because there's intelligence gain loss calculations that need to be made. And it's a different way of doing business, right? They need to tailor their communications, tailor their analysis for a different type of consumer. Indeed, this is a phenomenon that we are actually experiencing at the state and local level, which New America has been leaning forward on. Given that we have such a broad and diverse constituency of consumers from an intelligence perspective, how do we posture ourselves as government agencies to provide that intelligence? Then the other really interesting public policy question I hope we get to is, given all of this discussion, what is the role of the government in being a provider of cyber threat intelligence? Right now, the private sector owns that marketplace for consumers that are outside of government. So I think the position that I'm making is that it needs to be a shared responsibility across government and industry, but one where government plays a more active role than they have in the past. The joint analysis report was a step in the right direction, while the intelligence was not of the highest quality. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. I think from a public policy perspective, it sent a strong message.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. Rob.
Perfect. So yeah, I found my position in the rare time of being in disagreement. And although I feel that the government should share, and I do like the idea of sharing more in the right context and in the right ways, I found the specific report mostly damaging and a step in the wrong direction, given the quality of data that was shared. It is interesting from a policy perspective to see more focus on sharing, but the best quality of data related to threats actually tends not to be in the government. The best quality of data related to threats tends to be in the private sector companies that they themselves are targeted. So if we see a Russian, Chinese, Iranian, whoever group breaking into JP Morgan, Chase Bank, power grid locations, any significant location, the data related to what that threat looks like and how to defend against it at scale is contained in those companies. That's why incident response firms, in this case with the DNC, CrowdStrike, we've seen it with FireEye, Kaspersky, Symantec, name your firm, tend to have the best quality data related to those threats. So when it comes to government sharing, I look to them to have a different type of data than you might find already in the marketplace. I don't want the government competing with private sector intelligence companies. That's actually where we have a strong suit. I want them contributing to the analysis in ways that maybe they can't get so easily. As an example, for the government to come out and say, I agree with assessments that Russia hacked the DNC based off our sources and methods, they really don't have to provide anything to prove that. They can say, the proof is in the market, there's already data available, private sector analysis, but we're validating that data. And that's actually what happened in 2015 with the German parliament. Excuse me. In 2014, the German parliament was compromised by the same groups that compromised the DNC. In 2015, they came out and said, we validate that the private sector analysis is correct, and it was the Russian government that broke into the parliament. Nobody had any issue with that analysis at the time. The issue comes when you interject data that may not be substantial enough to prove your case. You actually detract from the analysis that's already been done. So I look to the government to share higher level knowledge, to share maybe attribution details, and to some level maybe unique samples of capabilities by the adversaries, but with the appropriate context of what to do about it. So more to the discussion where Dave and I disagreed was the report itself. Not to over-focus on it, but one of the things that I thought was a bit of a missed opportunity is a lot of the data was not descriptive of not only Russian activity, but it was not descriptive of malicious activity. As an example, Burlington Electric is the utility that sort of made the news on this. When they ran the technical indicators of this malicious activity, one of them was Yahoo Mail servers. And so somebody just logged into their Yahoo Mail account and it fired an alert saying, you've been hacked. And they contacted the DHS, and it turns out it was completely a false positive. Obviously, going to Yahoo Mail is completely legitimate. And unfortunately then, DHS officials leaked it to the media, giving a lot of strain on that company. So in my opinion, and in summary, I would say, first of all, the government needs to figure out how to share internally first, before it tries to share too much externally. In my time in the intelligence agency that I worked for, I consistently found that even if we had great information, it was a challenge to get it to the DHS or the Navy or the Army, let alone actually sharing it to the public. So there's internal issues that need to be addressed, and when we do go external, we need to put our best foot forward, otherwise we'll deter people from actually being involved.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Some additional context?
Yeah, so
Susan?
I think it's important to understand that this debate, which does occur inside the government as well as outside the government, is taking place against a backdrop of protections of sources and methods, how much information can safely be made public. And there really are two different purposes to information sharing or making information public. One is sharing security information, right? So cyber threat indicators, things that you want the public or other parts of the government to actually know in order to do something to defend them, to defend themselves. The other form is really about retaining credibility for attribution. So we saw both following the Sony attribution to North Korea, and also sort of post-DNC original attribution, that there was a lot of question in the public sector, both from actual security experts and also just the general media conversation about whether or not the intelligence community really could be sure. And so one thing that the government has been a little bit surprised to find is the way in which occasionally they think they can provide a particular amount of information, and then in order to retain their credibility when questioned, they actually have to provide additional information. So the determination that they're making as a threshold matter, they don't actually have 100% control. So Sony is actually a really good example of this. We saw FBI Director Jim Comey come forward and say, hey, it's North Korea, the first time the government had ever formally attributed an attack to a nation state. CrowdStrike and others sort of came forward and said, well, you don't know that based on what we've seen. It could be anybody. It could be this. It could be that. That essentially forced the government's hand. They had to come forward and say, well, yeah, it is all those other indicators, which there might be other explanations for. We have other ways of knowing. Maybe we were sitting on somebody's computers, right? That reveals sensitive information to North Korean operators, right? It says that they've been compromised. One thing that I think sometimes there's a lack of appreciation for is just the fragility of intelligence sources. I think a lot of people sort of assume that, hey, this one thing gets burned and come on, you guys have hundreds of others. This is a very, very complex ecosystem. And so things that are not always obvious can end up being really quite consequential over the long run.
Great. So let's go back to one of your original questions, Dave. And if each of you could just briefly comment on your focused perspective on what is the role of government in sharing, and you can talk about the different levels, but what do you believe is the role of government?
Sure. So to answer that question, I think it's important to scrutinize whether we think government or whether we think the private sector really has monopoly on the private or on the intel space, which I think we are not there, right? So I absolutely think government needs to be in this space. How I would characterize the role of government is essentially the same way we characterize the role of government within government, which is that the intelligence community treats policymakers and the military as customers. We need to treat the private sector, we need to treat citizens as customers. So I'm actually trying to change the verb. I'm trying to get away from sharing and focus on providing. The intelligence community is a service-based industry, right? They need to start thinking about expanding their customer base, which is going to have implications for how they do business. It's going to affect the calculus and their appetite for burning sources and methods, as Susan mentioned. So I think there's a very legitimate role there, provided, and the assumption underlying all of this is that they can be a valuable player in that marketplace, right? And I believe they are. I just believe there hasn't been an appetite yet to truly expand the customer base and be valued to a broader constituency.
Okay, thanks. Rob.
So I would agree that there's a role for the government in sharing, but I would note that when we've seen cases of technical information being shared to a broad audience, this is not the government's first misstep. And we've seen cases and cases and cases of bad data being shared, ultimately undermining the confidence the private sector has.
Was the data bad or was it incomplete?
In both, we've seen both cases.
Okay.
So in the Grizzly Step report on the DNC discussion as an example, I thought it was kind of odd that the White House came out and said, this is not an attribution report. Like our report coming later from the DNI is going to be about attribution. This is not about attribution. And then that report only had a page and a half of written text all about attribution. So it was actually a mismatching internal to their own goals and objectives.
Okay.
And the fact that they discussed attribution ahead of time actually undermined the ODNI report, and people were like, well, where's the actual proof? It sort of misaligned. But in terms of incomplete, it was also incomplete. If you would look through the technical data released in the Grizzly Step report as an example, and reports like it, the sanitization process in the government is sometimes overreaching.
Right.
And unfortunately, it leaves people confused. As an example, in the technical data, there was a column for when this activity was observed, which in terms of internet addresses and locations that traditionally can move, that's really important. Was this IP address malicious yesterday or a year and a half ago? It's going to completely change the context. They left the column in, but stripped out all the data. So it was kind of a tease to the community of saying, like, we have this data, it's just not something we're sharing with you. Unfortunately, that was probably the most vital data in the report.
But isn't it the type of data that could get to sources and methods?
So you can make that argument, but I would say no. And the reason I would say no in this case, but it could potentially, but in this case, I would say no, because if you think of the NSA, the CIA, their role and purpose generally is inform policymakers, not really network defense. But in doing that mission, they can get a lot of interesting capabilities and knowledge that can help network defense. However, at least from my own bias, from my own previous experience, I consistently found that the desire was to overclassify everything in protection of sources and methods instead of having an informed discussion. And when it would go over to senior members, they would think, oh, that's cool, it must be classified. I was like, oh, no, this is a technique used in the private sector. This is something we learned at a class. They're like, no, it's cool, it must be classified. So I think there's definitely an issue there. But going more to Dave's comment, I do think there's value in the government being involved, but the issue where the market isn't taking us isn't in the technical data, right? So the technical data, market's got that covered for the most part. More is sometimes better, but what's traditionally difficult.
When you say market, then
private
that
sector.
industry
Right.
can share at machine speed a lot of the technical data.
So the technical data tends to be shared quickly amongst the private sector.
Okay.
There is a desire to go to machine speed, which I actually think is potentially counter to what we want to do. As an example, the DHS has a program, AIS. It's
Right.
meant to share
Right.
indicators automatically. But if you talk to the people involved in the program, they'll tell you that they don't validate any of the data they get.
Right.
They just share it out as fast as possible to do
Right.
speed.
Right.
Unfortunately, bad data actually cost far more than just waiting to get good data. But from a Dave's perspective, though, on what do we really need to be doing sharing, in my opinion, the place that the market's not been traditionally good at is influencing strategic discussions at the executive level.
Okay.
So I would love for the government to be able to share knowledge to help influence chief security officers and CEOs and board of directors. But as far as technical products, knowledge, response tactics, that is something the private sector does very, very well.
Okay. So could you frame a little bit, Susan, before you talk, what sources and methods really means, just to level set with the audience?
Right, so it's broadly defined and really a question of tremendous discretion. But sources and methods are the various ways, both technical tools, human sourcing, the way the intelligence community gets their information.
So tradecraft and capabilities
Right,
and
techniques,
processes.
tactics, procedures, it
Right.
runs the gamut.
Right.
It's information that if the adversary learned of how something was collected, you potentially would lose that collection source. And so that is always, that's always
You're
the
walking that
intention.
line.
Right. So first, to sort of follow up on a point that Rob made, so NSA actually does have two missions. They have a signals intelligence mission, and then they have an information assurance mission. So they do have half of their job is about network defense. But it's not about the broad defense of all American networks or all government systems. It's about national security systems, a very limited and defined area that has really specific sets of equities. We actually designed it that way intentionally, right? We want one agency to just focus on those systems and make the best decision for those systems. And we created another agency to try and weigh those other equities, either about the .gov space and also sort of facing towards the private sector. I 100% take your point on overclassification. That's an issue across the board in the intelligence community in all kinds of different contexts. Whenever you're evaluating that sources and methods and you don't know what the future is going to look like, there is always a temptation to think, well, maybe this is the source that maybe one day it'll be the thing that we collect from, right? The incentives here run towards keeping information secret. That said, I do think that there has been a real effort over the past few years to try and share more information. And this is where you run up against a little bit of a problem of bureaucracy.
And
that's
a culture
Right.
culture of secrecy for a long time.
Right, and it's particularly acute in this space in which sharing information that is fast and wrong is as consequential as sharing information that is late and right? So having the perfect information that you've given a month later, well, who cares? It's too late.
Not actionable.
Right, and there's also consequences to putting out bad information. So one of the ways that this sort of tension works out, especially whenever you always have somebody in the room saying, but my sources and methods, my equities, I want to keep this secret, I don't care about that other thing, is to say, okay, for the hard choices, because we want to push information out to the public, we're just going to strip it out, right? I actually think that if you look at the report on hacking or sort of Russian interference in the election that was released just at the end of President Obama's administration, that reads to me like a document where there was lots and lots of information. They couldn't come to an agreement about what should be made public, and so they just stripped it all out and gave top-line conclusions. As Rob sort of mentioned earlier, the problem is that there's a mismatch between the context and the expectation and the actual information you're putting forward, and that actually can end up undermining confidence,
Right. Because
it looks like you aren't able to deliver what you promised.
So I kind of like how this is shaking out, and I'm sorry, Dave, I'll let you jump in. If we say, hey, government can give us that strategic, geopolitical, international impact, framework, and industry can give us that operational level context and even the technical, tactical level insights, that could be a nice combo. Why can't we bring that combo together? But make your comment first.
So it sounds symbiotic, but the devil's in the details, right? And I think it's too simplistic to say private sector's got the technical intel space, right? It's first of all, that space is very fluid, right? So
but it is all unclassified. So in other words, if a CrowdStrike or a FireEye were doing an assessment of an industry network as opposed to a proprietary or classified government network, there would be no reason why they couldn't, right, if they wanted to, give all the detail that we're talking about at an unclassified level.
That's true. The difference is, I mean, we got to talk about the role of government versus the role of industry. Industry's profit motivated, so that's a factor from the public policy perspective, which is great. We love capitalism, right?
Capitalism.
But for
so government protecting their sources and methods, and industry protecting
their
their proprietary capabilities that generate revenue.
Somebody's got to be working on behalf of the citizens for the best national interest. But I think we're not necessarily, it's got to be focused on capability, right? The people, if we value good intelligence, then the providers of that intelligence, it doesn't matter if it's public or private. The question from a policy perspective is, do we value it enough, assuming that the federal government is collecting valuable intelligence, to give up whatever sources and methods were associated with collecting that intelligence? I mean, private intel, most of their collection is based on incident response, right? So it's during or after the fact.
Right.
And it's not
it's more what's going on within my network that's abnormal, as opposed to looking beyond at what could be coming next.
Sure, and it's not necessarily inclusive of the entire threat landscape, nor is it inclusive necessarily of all the different sources. It's not traditional all-source intelligence. So I think in addition to the strategic technical comparison, we need to look across sources.
Okay.
And that's where government can be valuable, and I think they have been.
Okay.
And I think that is a really good position if we've seen the maturity needed by the government to operate at that level, and I don't think we have. We've seen the maturity of the government to know strategic knowledge, to have context that they want to be able to add to the discussion. We've also seen great private sharing before, where the NSA or CIA or some form of government will reach out through the appropriate parties to Microsoft, to vendors in the space, have them add context, and then everybody at once is able to act, take down adversary infrastructure, do good. So we've seen that. We've not really seen technical data being released to a broad audience where the government has got it right.
Right.
So in my opinion, if the government does want to get into the private sector, more technical data, they first need to show the maturity. As an example, so I see a lot of people in this space. I have a class where we train sort of all the incident responders to do intel. And if you ask them if CrowdStrike was knocking on your door or the FBI with a report, who would you trust more? I would guarantee you over 90% of my students would say CrowdStrike, because there's the context that they can then follow up with, and there's also an expectation that they've been working the cases. And yeah, Dimitri's just loving this, I'm sure. But
Shout
so
outs.
I'll give some
Okay.
case studies and some context to help make this a little more tangible. So in my previous role in one of the intelligence agencies, I stood up a mission to look at nation states breaking into industrial control system environments. So that was the team that I built is Iran, Russia, China, whoever, hacking into control system environments, power grid, water utilities, et cetera. We would routinely find information from open source. Now, I might know that it was Iran, China, Russia, and that was classified sources and methods, and the defenders didn't need to know the attribution. To be able to make changes on their network or defend, they didn't need to know who did it. They just needed to know it was an adversary and the technical details. All of the technical details we might get through public databases and open source information and public tools. But when I would try to pass that information to get to them, it would never get to them. I very tangibly remember a hydroelectric facility in the United States got compromised by a nation state level actor. The only thing that was classified about the entire case was the country that did it. None of the other data was even taken from government sources. When we tried to push it through the DHS to that location, it took over a month, and by the time it came through the system, all of the beautiful report and context and analysis that we'd written up got reduced to a single IP address. It was completely
Right.
non-actionable for them.
So you're bringing up a key problem, and then I'd like to spin it towards solutions, okay? Because I'm a problem solver. We have these tensions, right? Government can't totally freely share with industry because of certain sources and methods that they could lose, and so they're always walking that line. Industry has to protect their revenue and their reputation, so it doesn't always behoove them to openly share. So what is the way that we can bring those two entities together, perhaps through a third nonprofit entity? In other words, the way it is right now and has been at speed for over a decade doesn't scale, right? It's not repeatable, it's not consistent, it doesn't scale. So what are some options that we have that we could put in place that would allow us to take the benefit of both, scale, and get it out to the general public?
So I think this is where, as a government employee, I'm supposed to talk about public-private partnerships and information sharing and analysis organizations.
Got one
and
that's going?
everything's just going to come together. It's going to be automated, machine readable, and maybe throw some AI in there. I think, and I think Rob and I will agree here. I think the government needs to step up its game, and it needs to make some strategic policy decisions around whether it is willing to share more or less, or status quo, right? If the government makes a decision that it's going to sacrifice the investment associated with burning sources and methods, we're not talking about human beings here, so there's no, I'm just talking about technical sources and methods, then I think they can be a good player in this space, a valuable player, and then we can have a more symbiotic relationship between the public and private sector. But so long as government is not willing to sacrifice some of those technical sources and methods, which, by the way, we sacrifice every day. Like the NSA lost about 10 years with Edward Snowden, right? So I think sometimes we don't realize that Intel is as cheap as it is.
And fragile, like we were saying before.
But I think this needs to be driven by that key decision point, right? And unless, if the government is going to mature, I think it's less about maturity and more about accepting more risk, then I think we could have a symbiotic public-private partnership. But until then, industry is going to be protecting their intellectual property, government is going to be protecting their sources and methods, and eventually it's going to be a pretty regressive policy. State and local governments are going to lose, small businesses are going to lose. And that's how it'll work out.
Let's flip it up. You want to go next?
So I think this is an area in which the perfect is the enemy of the good. So we actually have a mechanism for information sharing. This CISA, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, was passed at the end of 2015. There is a portal. There's a process to get cleared individuals from various industries. Right? It's sort of the first steps towards I think, kind of the model.
And who runs it?
So formally it's through DHS, although there are multiple agencies are party to that real-time sharing system. It's come under a lot of criticism as not being particularly worthwhile, right? The indicators that are shared and who's really putting what in. And first, quite a bit was taken out because there were privacy concerns, right? So it's not just a matter of pure security considerations on the private sector side. They also have an obligation to protect their customers' information and customers that feel quite strongly about sharing with the most competent sort of agencies in terms of being able to act on that information. And so I'm not sure it's sort of CISA or the CISA portal has really taken hold. I think that's a shame, if only because that would be a great way to start developing some of those relationships, some of those connections, actually getting cleared representatives that are able to get this information, something to build upon, sort of, right? And if you build it, they will come sort of first step model. And so a little bit the backlash and sort of the maligning of, hey, here's the government that doesn't understand how this stuff works and isn't really helping us, and we're doing much more sophisticated work in the private sector, which is true. I think it might hinder getting to where we want to be over the long term. And so if we can start taking relatively modest steps and say, hey, maybe this isn't the most worthwhile thing in the entire universe, but it's a first step to getting to where we want to be, that might be more productive in the long run.
Yeah, and if I could completely agree with both points made about do we accept the risk, how do we take advantage of the programs we have. In my time working in sort of the threat space, the government has spent far more time and taxpayer money on trying to figure out the standards to which we share, like sticks and taxi, and nobody in the private sector has ever said like, oh, well, I just don't know if I'm going to send you a JSON or it's a sticks file. Like nobody argues that. Everybody knows how to process data in different formats. But that's where the government loves to focus. Well, let's spend another $1 billion worth of taxpayer money trying to figure out the standard, when everyone else has said, like, just show me good data. I don't really care the standard to which it comes. And the government's going to find that it's increasingly difficult to get the private sector to share the data to which it needs if it doesn't put out its best foot forward. As an example, going back to that industrial control system space, since it's sort of my bread and butter and I can speak a little bit better from it, my access to internal data for power grid, water utilities, et cetera, while in the intelligence community was lesser than it is now at my company. I have more information at my company about threats that are targeting industrial control systems than I ever had working in the US intelligence community. That sucks. That's a scary situation where national level leaders aren't getting that level of information. But if I go to my customers and say, hey, I don't think anybody's tracking that there's an Algerian APT group targeting water sector. Maybe you as a customer could go share that information with the government. The number one pushback I get is, what's the value? Like, what are they going to give me back? Because for a long time, the government's been seen as take. Number two is, are they going to leak it? And if it gets out, how is it going to affect the stock of my company? And we've seen time and time again, DHS officials leaking things. And the third to which is sort of going back to the details of how long is this going to take to train the point of contact I have on why this matters? Like, am I going to have to set up 2 months of meetings to explain to them what a control system is before they even understand the value of the data we're sharing? So I think we really need to get sort of the government doing more technical work while accepting the risk and using the programs we already have in place, instead of another committee, another group, another policy about is this critical infrastructure or not, another standard sharing framework. It's time for action or to remove yourself from the conversation.
So just to follow up briefly, because I do think it's notable, NSA actually has established for the first time a risk management officer, so somebody who's supposed to be making this exact calculation. How do we think about it? The other thing is it's very easy to sort of judge or make determinations from the outside. So I left NSA about a year ago, a year and a half, I guess time is moving quickly. And whenever this last hacking report came out, I was like, tweeting out, this is too little too late, and this is ridiculous, and they should have given more information, and I expected that they were going to go out in a blaze of glory and pull this information. It's right, because it's tempting to say, how could you not share this information? And I got sort of a perturbed email from a colleague saying, damn well we couldn't have shared that whole report, and we were justified in this, and you're not being fair, you're not being responsible here. And they're right. It's really easy from the outside to say there's no risk to sharing that information, or it's an acceptable risk, or I would have made a different choice. If you don't have all the information in front of you, you just don't know what the actual equities are.
So just one chime in and then circle back. We're still talking, though, about an evolutionary approach while we're drowning, okay? I still don't understand why we're not leveraging federally funded research and development centers that already exist. MIT Lincoln Lab, my old office at Carnegie Mellon CERT, Penn State, Hopkins APL. These are organizations that have people with clearances, with insight to government, and have people who are involved in cutting edge cybersecurity related research and development and processes and best practices. They're trusted by industry. They're trusted by government. They could be that third-party interlocutor that could then take the information from both sectors and then put it out in a manner that is actionable and shareable and with context. But government seems to be holding on to it's got to be me, and I don't think government's ever going to be trusted or be able to perform at speed for all of the reasons we've discussed. So why aren't we going to a different model, and maybe it's like the FS-ISAC model, where it's more of a third-party entity?
So speaking of FS-ISAC, I was going to note we already have this model, the ISACs, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, and then now Information Sharing and Analysis Organizations. ISALs, ISACs were entirely meant to be the central organization where the government shares data, the private sector shares data, it gets out to everybody, the government sees additional context, private sector gets additional data. In almost every single ISAC, the problem is nobody starts the sharing. And so government says, well, we'll wait until you have information for us. And the private sector says, well, screw you. Until you actually give me something for this, I'm not just going to give you all of our details. So again, I think it's a very astute question and point about using third parties. Somebody's got to kickstart that discussion.
Right.
Somebody's got to kickstart the process.
Yes.
And if it's going to be on somebody, it should be on the taxpayer-funded government,
I agree.
not on private sector.
And the FFRDCs do
Yes,
receive some
absolutely.
government funding.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and as usual, the academic institutions are a great example of why this could work in practice, because they do it, even amongst themselves, independent of industry. But it needs to be public-private academic, not just because it sounds good, but because they each can, in theory, bring something to bear, which is uniquely valuable information, right? But to Rob's point, there needs to be some incentive to take that first step or to be a valuable contributor. It's almost like this, and this is a dirty phrase, but a pay-to-play model for information
Incentives.
sharing. Right, where you're only going to get the data if you're given the data.
So think how much money the government is spending right now not to fulfill the mission in an effective manner.
Right, so I actually think that there's potentially an opportunity to really rethink what the government's role in this space is. So if you look at what various private sectors are doing, so we've mentioned financial services as a relatively good model. Some explanations for why that's the case. They lose money right away. They have a little bit of a tighter feedback loop. The industry that is doing the best in this space is not financial services, it's energy. The energy sector is really, really good at sharing information. The explanation for that is not because they just super love each other. It's because the way the energy sector works is they're quasi-monopolies. They don't compete with one another in the regions in which they operate. And so I think what we need to recognize is the lack of information sharing in other sectors is, to some extent, a market failure, right? There is some incentive that runs against sharing. So traditionally, where we see a little bit of a gap in that market failure, the government steps in to correct that role, to realign those incentives. So I think that's one way in which it might, if we're tearing up everything else in terms of how we govern, let's just throw kind of cybersecurity in there. The other place is potentially for DHS to reconceptualize their mission away from something that is, we're going to build this sort of uber central capacity, and frankly think of themselves more like FEMA, right? So FEMA doesn't have a fleet of helicopters. FEMA's not really anything. It's a coordination mechanisms, right? You need this, I have this. You need this, I can put you in touch with the person who has, whatever resource you need.
Synchronization, collaboration, transparency.
Right, with expertise, right, with legal authorities. That might be a more productive way to start thinking about these things, because we're not really going to be able to spend or sort of agency our way out of this. The problem is just way too complex, and it's changing too quickly for the federal government, which is not a very agile animal to keep up in the long term.
Okay. If I could bring up one of my pet peeves, so I'm going to bring it one level down. Even reading all the reports that did come out, if you don't have a cybersecurity clue and you're just a regular mid-sized or small business, I wouldn't have had any idea what to really do with the information that came out, okay? When are we going to start, sharing real insights for real people, and does anyone do that today?
I'd actually turn that around a little bit.
Okay.
And here's, I'll offer a different perspective, because in New Jersey, at the state and local government level, we deal with a lot of small business, a lot of medium-sized businesses, local governments, municipal public utilities. They might have one or two IT guy or gal, but they're not well-versed in InfoSec. But they're smart enough to know what an indicator is, or they're well-versed enough to know what an indicator is. And the criticism of the InfoSec community is almost, and I mean this compassionately,
Of course.
an elitist criticism based on a much higher standard that may not exist for the majority of consumers, right?
Exactly.
So we need to think about, the little guy who actually might learn a lot or take away a lot from a report that says what is seemingly obvious to expert InfoSec practitioners, but it's not obvious to small businesses. For example, there's a lot of bad stuff coming from Tor exit nodes, so we should block that traffic at the perimeter.
But even that, you realize that 90% of all mid-sized and small businesses don't even have CISOs or CIOs, and may or may not have IT directors, right?
Sure.
So it's really more of a digital literacy thing. It's the basics. So I get what you're saying, if you have that entree point, but a lot of folks don't.
Well, as an InfoSec elitist. I will
Where's
note.
your crown?
Yeah, exactly.
They wanted
Hashtag SCADA-diva. But I completely agree it's a state and local thing. Like, if we're going to do better in this space,
agree.
federal
Yes.
government's got to back out, or at least empower, incentivize.
Yes.
State and locals, where you actually bring people to the table, have the discussions, do it.
Yes.
I also completely agree that the InfoSec community is its own worst enemy. They will sit and cry and argue about things that they may not have any experience with. And they get quoted in the media as a cybersecurity expert that should also have a little asterisk, who's never worked attribution cases before. And yet they're commenting about global attribution.
Right.
But if that's the goal, that's more of the strategic, here's what's invaluable and important. It's still not the technical indicators.
Right.
It's the Russian threat actually was active, here's the type of discussion around them,
Right.
not here's a Tor exit node, because they're not going to be able to use that in a meaningful way necessarily anyways, to your point. So at least let's not give them bad data, which if they actually do hire an elitist to come in and then look at that, never gonna let you live that down, hire somebody to come in and look at that, they're going to go, well, this is bad. And the next question is, I wonder if the other data was bad too. You absolutely have a role for government, I do think it's state and local, to push out context and get the discussion going and to incentivize security discussions. Pushing out bad data will consistently undermine that message.
I want to open it up for questions soon, but I would like to, again, circle back very quickly on if you could make one thing happen, Susan, like tomorrow, you're something you've been working on for a while or something you know that could have impact in this space, on this issue, what would that one thing be that you would like to see?
This a little bit runs against kind of the broader currents of what we've been talking about, but I think the biggest issue is establishing classified, cleared individuals in critical private sector to get rapid information, getting them to a place where they can ingest that information, use it in a way that is secure, develop those trust relationships, because not all threats are alike, not all consequences are alike. We're going to have to prioritize here, and I think we should start prioritizing the private sector companies that have real impacts on the safety and
that have
economic
critical
security of Americans.
roles.
Exactly.
Right.
Right? Critical
Yeah.
infrastructure,
Critical.
one might say.
Yes.
But if everything is critical infrastructure, then nothing is critical
Right.
infrastructure. So starting to take some pragmatic, incremental, but concrete steps towards achieving some kind of progress on that.
Okay. Rob.
I read like all of her stuff. I think you're incredibly intelligent, but I'm going to disagree with you. So I just want to like note. I wanted to like time out. I think you're the smartest one of us up here, but no offense, but
She's also the prettiest. I just want you to know.
I'm not winning anything in this.
And I could say that.
That being said, the idea of more cleared individuals to get access to data, it bothers me, because when we worked sort of at the threat operations level for the national government, we wouldn't even make things secret that were good because we were afraid the Army was going to leak it to the Afghanistan partners. Right? So if we had anything, it was top secret, just by default.
Right.
Getting cleared individuals to come in with secret level clearances to get access to data does almost nothing, and I have
So what if
far
they had
more
top
horror
secret?
top secret security clearances. Here's what happens.
Okay.
Happens almost every time. Anytime that I've been involved in a discussion or any war story that I've heard from peers in the community, they go in for these briefings about here's this latest threat or here's this data, and they're like, here's these 5 IP addresses, they're from China. And like, okay, great. Like, what do you want us to do with this? And they're like, that's this new group. And the private sector's like, actually, we've been tracking them for the last year. Here's all this data related to it.
Because we own 95%
of the critical infrastructure. So I'll note that, to me, it's not an issue of who can access the data, because then you also create a community of have and have-nots. And I don't know how many times in the private sector now, and I only left in 2015 from the government, but I don't know how many times I've heard somebody be like, I'd tell you, but it's classified. And I'm like, I worked that program, you weren't involved. You know, it's just people use that as a banner to keep sort of be gatekeepers. My solution, I would look to very heavily incentivizing state and local level to build the partnerships at the strategic discussion, let the private sector figure out what it's doing as well, because there are mass miscommunications even in the private sector around, do we want indicators, do we want behavioral analytics, do we want tradecraft, what is the solution? By the time the government then takes and codifies what they think the answer is, it'll have already shifted. So I much prefer the strategic level analysis, bringing in partners at that level, incentivizing through maybe tax credits for cybersecurity training at those levels. That is the stuff. Getting smart people at each location is going to be far more impactful than another IP address.
Okay.
Real quickly, I would revise the risk calculus around sources and methods to be more in favor of network defenders, less in favor of intelligence collectors. Where that goes on the spectrum, is a very complicated and detailed discussion, but I think it needs to go more in favor of network defense. I think it's too much in favor of the intel community right now.
Okay. Okay. Questions? How do we do this? Good. I'm glad people are awake. Please. Go ahead.
I'm Graham Dietz from Sasakawa, USA. We do a lot of work with US and Japan on cybersecurity, and Mr. Lee, I love the point that you just made about getting more educated InfoSec folks in the private sector, because on both sides of the Pacific, what we get is we want more government help because we don't have the resources for the technology and we don't have the people. And we tell them, no, don't do that, because that's just inviting this whole big complicated thing that you just unpacked right now. So I want to ask the panel, but Mr. Lee's in particular, what would you like to see expand a little bit on what you want to see in educating information security professionals to bring to the small, medium-sized business, local and state government?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I'd like to see, and one of the points that she made that I thought was very astute, is around we have mechanisms already in place. So from coordination body perspective, I would love to see the federal government be able to say, here are 16 classes in the private sector industry that we've looked at that fit certain job skills and the requirements that you think it's going to meet at these small and medium-sized businesses. These are the places to start. Here's the roadmap, right? You're not going to have a small company hire Deloitte or CGI or some other big firm to come in and tell them how to build a security operations center if they ever want one. That's not the place to start anyways. So getting that repeatable model in place with here are the things along that maturity scale that you can do, and here's the classes that map to it, and oh, by the way, we will give you tax credits to actually go and invest in your people, not just write-offs, but saying if you invest in cybersecurity skills that you don't have innately today, we will give you tax credits to be able to do that, not buy another product from the vendor. I mean, I'm a vendor that sells technology, and I'm the first person to admit it's not a technology answer. It's a people problem. So use the federal government, validate which classes along that maturity scale is useful, then give tax incentives in the form of credits to actually get people trained at individual locations.
I would also jump in that I think one area where DHS has done a great job is with the NICE initiative, the National Initiative for Cyber Education with NSA, where they helped by putting in place what are the 31 career fields that are related to this space, what are the skill sets that you need, and then built the whole body of centers of academic excellence. I think there's over 150 colleges and universities across the nation that then had to comply with certain standards, because what that does is it scales the 1-year, 2-year, 4-year graduate programs across this landscape, because what we need, right, is the creation of more of those programs, and then the education back to the high schools and junior high schools of what are those professions. Get me excited about them. Have the counselors tell them about them. You know, we need everybody producing at speed in this space.
If I could, I'm sorry.
So look, these are both very nice sort of carrot solutions. I'm more of a stick person myself. Find it works a little faster. Like both, they both work together. Liability is the big issue here, right? If you want to get a company to care about something, to invest in something, you have to make it worthwhile to them to do so. The fastest way to get that done is whenever companies fail to undertake sufficient, reasonable protective practices of data, and individuals are harmed and can demonstrate that they're harmed by that negligence, the company has to pay. That's going to be the fastest way to start really getting those broad pressure. Yes, education. Yes, absolutely. There has to be a pipeline. Otherwise they aren't going to have a solution to turn to. But I think that's something that we're going to have a little bit more candid of a conversation with, and the private sector's done a pretty nice job of pushing that down the road. But I think we're reaching the point where we really need to potentially think about some statutory solutions.
And real quickly, I think on the subject of education and workforce development, we can't have that discussion without talking about the gender disparity in this field right now. I mean, there are no women working in this field, generally speaking, with the exception, of course. But I went to a student-run hackathon at a high school in Bergen County, New Jersey, a couple months ago, and there were 3 out of 100 students that were female. So I don't quite know how we address this, but we're not gonna have enough supply of talent unless we tap women as well.
Women in STEM.
Yeah.
And I'll note that even in those locations, I see private sector leading the discussion.
Yeah.
Like at SANS, as an example, is the largest or most trusted cybersecurity training group,
Yep.
right? And that's
Yep.
where I teach classes at, because it's where we get
They're
things
very
done.
good.
5-day class instead of a 4-year program, right? What they did that I thought was very interesting is they said, hey, if you're a lady in this career field or want to be in this career field, we'll give you like $100,000 worth of training. Like we will get you through a 6-month boot camp of getting up to speed, and then we will guarantee find you a location in the industry. That's all because the founders are a nonprofit and they just want to be able to do this.
Right.
Where's the government sort of incentive and doing similar? I think everybody, I think Dave's absolutely correct. Everyone can note the gender disparity as a huge issue. Like, groupthink is never a good thing regardless. But the government needs to actually do something instead of discussing it more. It's not a tweet. It's a policy.
That we're way behind in this field because there's so few women in it. Okay, next question. Back there real quick, sorry, and then we'll come forward.
Ian, you're not allowed to ask questions. Like, what is this?
The reason we're having this is so I can ask questions.
Oh, okay, all right. Dance puppet, no, all right.
So info sharing is a hardy perennial of kind of policy discussions. Think tanks talk about it all the time. It's great to have a discussion that's as rich as this. But my question is, at a time where everything is being rethought, where should we be putting info sharing in the wider context of things we need to get done in cybersecurity policy? Is this right at the top, or is this something we should put aside and focus on other things? And we've discussed some of this already, but just give us some context about how much what you've been arguing for matters compared to other things we need to worry about.
So from a national security perspective, this is a team sport, right? You know, having your fort and your wall is not going to work. And so that's why information sharing, but I would take it up a next level because I'm a cyber intelligence person. It's cyber intelligence sharing that I think is most critical, right? It's with context and insight, and it's actionable. And so, yes, it's at the foundation of everything that we need to do, because the only way you'll prevent is by sharing and getting ahead.
I think one thing that is potentially a learning moment for the federal government, and I think the threshold challenge is just getting this administration to prioritize cybersecurity, to understand the threat, understand they're going to have to invest in this space and quickly.
But Giuliani's got it.
Oh, we're screwed.
No comment.
I didn't comment, we're screwed. Go ahead.
That said, I think that if you had asked someone 5 years ago whether or not they thought that the first sort of major breakthrough moment on a nation-state attack would be a movie studio, right? That was the first time we were going to have to sort of address the attribution issue. I think that if you had suggested to someone sort of even post Sony leaking information or post OPM, that potentially spear phishing was going to have significant consequences on how, I don't know, we perceive the legitimacy of the office of the President of the United States. This notion that there's like the national security space, that it's Cyber Command and it's NSA and then there's everybody else, we're having a pretty dramatic example right now of this stuff is all connected. It all has to be addressed because things that you never imagined would have national security consequences, they are having them.
Yeah, so I would agree. And I would add that I would start with the cyber threat intelligence perspective from a strategic level, not tactical. Not here's a bunch of indicators of compromise. They have the lowest half-life. They're the least mature form of intelligence. There we go. But I would start with the strategic aspect, telling everybody, level setting, here's the actual threat, here's the potential impact, here's the risk to your business operations. Then go from there and have sort of that sliding scale of cybersecurity discussion. Do you really want to stand up a security operations center when you don't even know what's on your network and you're not patching it? Probably not. Like, let's start with the basics. The whole cyber hygiene word was big for a while, but let's do that at the same time that the private sector is sort of moving in that direction, the tax incentive programs for education to get us there. The US and the federal government should actually just focus much more on getting its house in order. That way, when it does come to the discussion, it has that combined front. In a good example of sort of the disparity, in 2015, we saw the first cyber attack on a power grid that led to the outages of the regions. So Ukraine, cyber attack, 2015. It took 2 months and a day after the attack happened for the DHS to even acknowledge that it happened. That's not information sharing, that's burying your head in the sand. From there, at the same time,
on their defense.
well, they actually had all the data. So I was a lead investigator on it. We gave them all the data. They just didn't want to talk about it because they were afraid it was going to scare the industry. When we looked at the components that went into that, at the exact same time we actually had the first nation-state cyber attack on a power grid, the DHS IA, their intelligence branch, put out weeks later a report that cyber attacks on the power grid were likely not to happen. And at the same time, Admiral Rogers was coming out of Cyber Command and NSA saying it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So there's so many missed messages already occurring inside of government as it is, where the DHS can't agree with the NSA can't agree with the no discipline in a combined message.
Right.
You can have your internal disagreements, but if we go back to intelligence practitioners, Sherman Kent, combined judgment, we have none of that. So the private sector many times looks at them and goes, y'all figure your stuff out, we'll just do it ourselves because we're not getting help from you. That's what we need to get in order.
Real quickly.
And then we'll get to the next
I would
question.
say, to answer your question, Ian, we need to focus less on info sharing. I think info sharing, not to diminish it as a component of cybersecurity and our national cybersecurity policy, it's gotten an undue amount of attention relative to the larger problem over the last 8 years. I think probably because it's the only thing lawmakers can really grasp. I think we need to continue moving down the path that we have been. We need to continue to improve what CISA has provided for us. But we also need to turn our attention to other bigger issues, I think, moving forward.
Okay. We had a question down front.
Sure, thanks. So actually, Terry, I'm glad you mentioned Rudy Giuliani. President Trump's scheduled to have lunch with Giuliani today, and I know he's been touted as this sort of liaison between the private sector and the Trump administration. I know you all may not be able to comment directly on Giuliani's role, but I would just be curious to know kind of to what extent there can even be a top-down influence on the goals that you're describing, and what you would then hope to see from the Trump administration in this space. Thanks.
So just real quick, I actually worked informally with a team at INSA to put together what I call a cyber reset for whoever was going to be the next administration. So this was like 6 or 8 months ago. But it was all about the kind of objectives that we've been discussing today and then actionable recommendations. And these are executable things that leverage incentives, small government investments that could actually, I think, have a huge impact vis-a-vis the speed with which we've been moving the last 10 years and the speed with which we could be moving if we truly incentivize focused private-public partnerships and initiatives in certain areas. So I think there's definitely things that could be done.
So I agree that there are things that can be done. I think one thing that's going to be incredibly critical in terms of the message from the top is this just is not an area where that can be become an ideological conversation, right? This has got to be sort of pragmatic, strategic, reality-based, because if this is an area in which sort of broad anti-regulatory instincts or pro-business or pro-privacy or whatever sort of, if that's what ends up sort of capturing the conversation, and I think we've seen a little bit of an instinct towards oversimplification, which is unfortunate, that's not going to get us to the right answer. So to the extent that there is going to be leadership from the White House, and this is an important issue and they should lead on it, they need to really, it needs to be a place in which they embrace experts, embrace the community, and really try and separate out as much as possible kind of the political, ideological stuff, because it's just a waste of time.
So I will comment on Giuliani specifically and sort of that position. A couple years ago, I wrote a piece about Michael Daniel when he gave a comment that he was glad he didn't have a technical background because it kept him out of the weeds. I wrote a Forbes article basically chastising that, saying it was one of the most idiotic things you could say while also trying to incentivize the community to embrace STEM education. We traditionally don't put people that actually have backgrounds in the positions that they need to be in. We say, oh, he or she's got a background in policy and management, so they'll be a great cybersecurity expert. The cybersecurity community then looks at that and goes, well, we're not being represented. We don't really want to have this discussion. Giuliani, looking back, turns out Michael Daniel at least was comparatively better. Giuliani has even less experience in that security discussion. And if we continue to take political appointees who have no background in anything that they're representing to the public, don't be surprised if the community turns a deaf ear, right? So I would love to see us take, for cybersecurity specifically, the White House cybersecurity czar, if you will, that individual, that person needs to have backgrounds in policy and in tech. And for the folks that have pushed back historically and said, well, we don't have those people yet, that's just not true. We have numerous CSOs, CISOs, CEOs with great technical background that could absolutely serve in those positions correctly. And I agree that just it should be nonpartisan as well. When you talk about cybersecurity, especially when you talk about critical infrastructure, there's no Republican versus Democrat kind of debate there. We need to do better. How we do better might be sort of the differences. But I would at least hope we can decide that the person who's flying the aircraft should understand how aerodynamics work.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think the cyber EO is going to drop today. If it's anything like the draft, it's pretty generic. I would imagine that if there's going to be any action up front from a top-down perspective, it's probably going to be military-centric, at least initially. But we'll see where it goes. Who knows?
Okay.
Just a plug, Mike has written an excellent piece on Lawfare about both of these issues. Two of them.
I'm sorry, where were we on questions?
Hi, my name's Chris Bing. I'm a reporter with FedScoop. So actually just following up on that last point, I know it's a very broad policy question, but there's not many details right now. Do you think DoD should take some of the responsibilities that currently exist within DHS as it pertains to information sharing and defense of domestic networks? This is a point that the Trump administration brought up early on. There's not many details there, but can you speak broadly to that idea? Thank you.
So without much detail, I think as a rule, DoD should shy away from that space. There's capabilities that DoD can bring to bear in terms of the protection of critical infrastructure, but there's lots of authorities issues there that Susan is more well-versed or better versed than I. But generally speaking, I think they should shy away from that. DoD's got plenty on its plate as it relates to cyber that it should focus on.
Yeah, I agree. This is one of the instincts that I think has been a little bit troubling. I'm unclear whether or not it's from inexperience or an actual sort of sense of thinking DoD is the proper lead here. So one, militarizing sort of the civilian security space is not a good idea. We both have a statutory posse comitatus that's pretty limited, but also the principle, right? The military does not engage in domestic law enforcement, and we like to keep those separate. And so just from a legal authority standpoint, you're sort of down the thicket. The other really sort of serious question here is anything that DoD does that is not within its mission set, that's taking away resource and time and energy and expertise. DoD is busy, and so the idea of just expanding their role, they're not going to be able to do the really, really critical work that they do as well, and that is an enormously consequential thing. And I really don't think DoD is the answer, and I don't think DoD believes that they are the answer here.
But I don't think DHS is the answer.
Yeah,
So that's where I do think a private-public partnership that DHS could take all of the millions that they're putting into this mission that they're not scaling today and work with several FFRDCs and stand up these centers of excellence and start the scaling and have it be trusted and actually have technical, operational, and large picture depth, which DHS is going to take another 10 to 15 years to develop. We can't wait for them to get there.
There is, and I use the word knowing that it's been overused, but there is a crisis in terms of the military services in manning. And there is a significant morale issue across not only cybersecurity, but whether it's pilots for aircraft or whatever else. They've been spread extremely thin with an increasing mission, and a lot of folks are getting out. So I left the military 2015. At the time, everybody was getting out. Now that I'm in private sector, I get flooded on a day-to-day basis with people that knew my name in the military of like, hey, are you hiring? I got to get off this sinking ship. Nobody wants the military to be less effective at whatever we use them for. And no matter what your position is on the NSA, as an example, which tends to be a hot topic item, I think whether you're on the privacy discussion or not, we could all agree that we don't want a more incompetent NSA. So having the people focus on what they actually are good at, well, maybe not. Well, this isn't the Intercept. So as far as actually having a serious discussion, I would note that the DoD needs to focus on what it does best. But I also agree it's not the DHS, it's private sector with support from the government. I don't think that anybody that's ever interacted with the DHS during an incident has been inspired.
The other thing that's it's important to clarify is that there's a difference between sort of DHS as a headquarters body and the really and the really excellent investigative units in the Secret Service and other places. So there are elements that are doing just really important on the ground work. It's more sort of those broader structures that tend to get kind of heavy.
Yeah, I would note that just to piggyback on that, even when I'm critical of the ICS-CERT's handling of the Ukraine scenario, it was never of the ICS-CERT, it was never of the people. The Grizzly Step report, I knew many of the intelligence analysts that put data into that. Fantastic people working amazing mission sets. The bureaucracy's getting in the way.
And then quick.
All right.
Do you think that the federal government burned sources and methods just in the release of the, no matter how flawed it was, of the DHS FBI report and then the ODNI report?
No.
You don't think so?
No.
Because there's this like ongoing crazy chapter right now going on in
Really?
Russia.
Yeah, is the
Okay.
question,
Burn
did
sources
they
and
burn
methods?
sources
Did-
and methods
You're talking
by
about, like, conspiracy
publishing?
arrests and things similar.
Yeah, but I think there's also the larger topic of was there any type of degradation of capabilities, whether it's human intelligence or signals intelligence, as a result of either the ODNI report or the FBI DHS that came out prior? Thanks.
So look, there's not enough information to actually draw a direct line. There's lots of different information that was brought to the public. We have these reports. We also have this somewhat salacious dossier. There's lots of sort of different things going on. It is, I think it's just an area in which we should be very careful. Clearly, sort of following revelations about DNC hacking, Russian security services undertook a closer look at their own internal security. That has consequences. I think that also speaks to sort of the unpredictability and fragility of those sources. You never quite know what might set what off, but with the notion that there's, hey, this is the line in that document, and that's why somebody got arrested, I just don't think that information's there.
The ODN, yeah, absolutely. The ODNI saying, the Director of National Intelligence saying, we know for a fact that this is going on, we have a high confidence, could have absolutely set off that whole thing. Just from saying we know, they could have done their own investigation. From the technical report that was released and the evidence that was released, I would go one step further and say, no, you couldn't have taken anything out of that technical report and reversed it to be any level of discussion about sources and methods.
Right. Sir.
Rob Pecoraro, Yahoo Finance. Since we were talking about political appointees, we can't really ignore the President of the United States and his statements on InfoSec. We don't know who it could be someone in the basement, never trust a computer. Seems to be kind of a computer's boy, I don't know attitude. How does that affect your job of getting people to take security seriously?
Well, yeah, because I think you need to finish the sentence, which is, yes, he is correct that anything driven by software, right, can be hit by malware. What it means is that we need a more risk-based, pragmatic approach, which is you're not going to protect everything, but you do need to know what your top targets from a federal government are, right? I mean, okay? So in other words, yes, this is true, but no, that's not the end, okay?
So, look, the issue here is exploiting some level of technical question, right? Which is important to be candid about the ability to have absolute certainty versus high confidence. Exploiting that sense of uncertainty for political reasons, right? To sort of undermine. When the U.S. intelligence community says they have high confidence on an attribution issue, they have absolute near certainty on that issue. And so I'm hopeful that President Trump will very, very quickly come to understand that his intelligence community is a critical body, and that he needs to believe in them, and that the American people need to believe in them. And walking down this path is a pretty dangerous road.
All the intelligence community does is present facts. It says, here's our assessments, here's our facts. The notion that they're politicized is ridiculous. And I believe the administration's choice to politicize the intelligence community will ultimately be very damning to their own positions. There was nobody serious in this debate that ever thought it was a 400-pound hacker in a basement. You don't leverage a decade worth of operations, because this wasn't just about the DNC.
No.
In the case of that group, ABT 28, ABT 29, we have about a decade of reporting on them. So unless your 400-pound hacker in the basement is working the equivalent of 300 positions across 10 years, across hundreds of organizations around the world that they've targeted, not likely. But I would further note that it's actually helped my position in the private sector. I found that there was companies who were debating whether or not it was actually nation-state attribution in Russia and what happened. And when Trump came out with the utterly ridiculous comments that was a 400-pound hacker, all the companies that were debating it were like, oh, well, if Trump says it's a 400-pound hacker, it's got to be a nation-state, then he's just wrong. So I thought that he was a good sounding board to reverse it exactly.
Okay, so are we out of time? Okay, but I want to thank a great audience, super questions, but an even better panel. Very impressive. Thank you so much.